Welcome to Divorce TV. I'm your host, Wally Marcus. Our topic today is Catholic marriage and separation. My very special guest is Reverend John Lyons, who I've been chatting with and having a fascinating conversation with prior to starting the show. Reverend Lyons, welcome again. It's a pleasure having an old Tucsonan like you on the show, and who knows all the history as well as everything else about Tucson. Can you tell us a little bit about yourself?
Sure. As you mentioned, I was born in Tucson in 1947. I'm a graduate of St. Peter and Paul, South Point High School, the University of Arizona, University of Law. Practiced law for about 10 years here in Tucson, and at the age of 38, decided I wanted to go away to Roman Catholic Seminary, and I went to a place we called the Old Folks Home. It was all second career guys. And I was ordained a priest in 1941 in 1988. Well, I'm getting near 65, it's getting there. And I've been a priest ever since, and right after I was ordained, Bishop sent me away to what we call, since I was a civil lawyer, to what we call church law, canon law. And I have a degree, a licentiate in canon law from the Catholic University of America.
Okay, when we get your title on the screen, we're going to barely be able to fit it all on there on doing all those things, but it really is, I admire you for doing all those things. Reverend Lyons, the Catholic Church does not recognize divorce, although I think that there is some, as I know, as with law, there's some variations on all those things. What is the actual policy towards divorce?
Well, as you said, I'm giving you the simple answer today that admits of many exceptions and expansions. The Church believes that any sacramental marriage is indissoluble. A sacramental marriage is a marriage between two baptized Christians. And that doesn't mean just baptized Catholics. We would believe two Lutherans who get married, or a Lutheran and a Baptist, or a Catholic and a Baptist. Those are sacramental marriages and can be dissolved only by death itself.
Okay. And that would be performed by anybody?
If you're a Catholic, you are held to what is called form. And that means you need to be married in the church if one of the two parties is Catholic. But that can be dispensed with also.
And if they aren't married in the church?
We don't recognize the marriage if it's a Catholic.
Okay. And so there's this, and then non-sacramental marriage would be?
Non-sacramental marriage would be two unbaptized people, or a baptized person and a non-baptized person.
Okay. And if it was a sacramental marriage, if I'm not oversimplifying it, no divorce at all?
No divorce.
Okay.
There's no divorce in the other sense either. It's just, it is dissoluble. You want to use the civil term divorce, and I'm using the word dissoluble or indissoluble. And as you know from the scriptures, the Petrine privilege, St. Paul said you can dissolve a marriage as long as the parties were both unbaptized to begin with, and we call that the Pauline privilege.
Oh, it's getting confusing, I guess, because now the more and more the word divorce isn't being used, and they actually use the word dissolution of marriage, so it's getting even more confusing. So at that point, there would be the Pauline privilege. Okay, at that point. And so what would happen if the couple, we have a marriage, sacramental marriage, and then the parties want to separate? What happens?
Well, we usually don't get involved, or almost always don't get involved, until after the parties have been civilly divorced. Okay, as an old civil lawyer, you know the expression of tortious interference in a marital relationship. Well, that isn't the law anymore, but everybody's still conservative about it. In the Catholic Church, while there is no such thing as Catholic divorce, there's what's known as an annulment. An annulment merely says the marriage was invalid to begin with. There never was a marriage, okay? And perhaps if I can explain what we think makes marriage, you'll see how we look at annulments, okay? No. We think marriage is a giving of and granting of consent between two people who are free to marry and are competent to do it, okay? And they do it freely. They do it of their own volition, all right? A radical example would be the old shotgun marriage. We would not think of that as a marriage because there's force and fear involved.
Even if it was sacramental? Or
there is no... Sacramental marriage is defined as two baptized persons freely and knowingly giving consent and being free to marry, okay? So when we're involved with, for instance, force and fear, now, you and I both know that there aren't very many shotguns in weddings anymore, but there is a form of a shotgun. We call it reverential fear. Someone gets pregnant. Mom says, "I'll never speak to you unless you marry him." They get married. Is there free will there? Have you made a free and open decision to do that? And some would argue, and I think in appropriate case it can be demonstrated, that there was no freedom. It's the same as the shotgun to the head. Mm-hmm. Your mother will never speak to you again if you don't get married. We would say there's no freedom to marry, and therefore, if we could prove that up, and that's a different subject, in our church court, then we would say there was no marriage to begin with. And so we're not dissolving a marriage, we're saying there never was one to begin with, and hence the word annulment as opposed to divorce. Or so.
So I'm trying to walk through this at this point. Catholic couple gets a civil divorce.
They come and see their parish priest, and the parish priest says, "Tell me your story." He listens to the story. He then gets some forms out, and he fills out these forms and asks the person, and this is probably the hardest part of the process for a person, to write the story of the marriage. And we ask them questions about themselves and their spouse. We ask them to describe their dating relationship.
This is the annulment?
Annulment form. We ask them to
this is
the beginning of the process.
For annulment.
Right. It's called a petition, just like in a court. And, understand that almost all of the common law that we know from England really developed out of the Church's canon law. Okay, you petition. They then write a story about their courtship, because that's where we find a lot about freedom to marry. And then they describe the day of their marriage, and I can tell you why that's important in a minute. And then they describe how the marriage went after that. Now, that's not particularly probative of anything, because we're looking at the point the consent is given, okay? But as you know, as an old lawyer, you can look to see what happens later sometimes to demonstrate a state of mind at the time that the consent is given. So I just gave you an example of force and fear. Another example might be more relevant and TV-ish. They're both high on marijuana when they give consent. How can you say that's knowingly giving consent? So we want to know what happens that day. Okay, so
assuming there isn't all that, what happens at that point?
At that point, that goes to a petition, and the petition's filed with the tribunal that has jurisdiction. This is just like the civil courts. There are places that have jurisdiction. Places that have jurisdiction over an annulment are always the diocese in which you were baptized.
Does that mean even if you were
if you were baptized, let's say in Manila, Manila would always have jurisdiction over the case.
So you have to...
No, you don't have... I'm giving you the first place of jurisdiction. Always has jurisdiction.
It's interesting you say that. The question I always get from people, maybe that's where it comes from. I've consistently always asked for, do we have to get divorced where we were married? And I think I finally know where that comes from.
So that's jurisdiction. That's jurisdiction always has jurisdiction. Can never be displaced from jurisdiction. The second place that always has jurisdiction is the place where the respondent, in the civil terms, the defendant, lives. So if you were married in New York City, and you could always file an annulment in the Archdiocese of New York. If your former spouse now lives in Boston, you could always file an annulment in the Archdiocese of Boston. Both would have jurisdiction. The third kind of jurisdiction is more complicated, as all things are. The place where the petitioner lives has jurisdiction with two caveats. The first caveat is that it's within the same Episcopal conference as where the respondent lives, and that would be defined as the Episcopal Conference of the United States. Now we think, well, that's easy, they'll figure that out, but that wouldn't include, for instance, Puerto Rico, which is part of the Caribbean Episcopal Conference. It would include the contiguous 48 United States, Hawaii, Alaska, and for some strange reason, the Virgin Islands. They would be in the same Episcopal Conference. That causes problems for us here in the border, because we have people who are married in Mexico whose spouse, the respondent, still lives in Mexico, in which case we don't have jurisdiction over the marriage, even though they live here. It also requires the consent of the judicial vicar, a person like myself, of the diocese where the person lives who's the respondent.
This is all the petition on the annulment. This being the case, it sounds complicated.
It is. It is complicated.
How long does all this ultimately take then? And how much does it cost?
Okay, well, two different questions. The first question is, it depends. How much cooperation we get how many cases are filing, and how many people are working in the tribunal. A general rule is about 1.5 to 2 years, okay, if we get cooperation. Recognize that in the church's law is very European. It's code law. It's not common law, okay? And so if you ever experienced European law other than English law, the parties themselves are not material witnesses. You have to find other parties who can testify to the fact you're interested in. Or experts. For instance, we entertain psychological experts who've examined parties and give us testimony about them. The parties can tell us, and they tell us their story, and we can use that, but if it's unsupported by other evidence, there's nothing we can do. So the entire process in the United States, in most dioceses, is all paper. Okay, this is not some courtroom, and you sit here.
Are they paying for it, or are they?
Well, yeah. Let me finish that part, and I'll tell you where we're going. And so you're going to send a bunch of written questions to people they got to respond to. Okay, the normal annulment cost in the Diocese of Tucson is around $1,200. More than half of that is funded from the bishop's appeal. We ask the petitioner, if they can, to pay $450 or $500, I forget which it is, of that. But no person is denied an annulment because they cannot afford it. It'll be given the pro bono, to use the civil term, by the church. No one has ever stopped because they don't have the money.
It just occurred to me, I mean, we were sort of kidding around before we started recording about the Jewish faith that the male has to agree to the Jewish divorce, the get. But what happens in this situation where one party wants the annulment and the other party doesn't want the annulment?
Very common situation. It doesn't stop the annulment. It may take longer, but it does not stop the annulment. There is no veto power. As a matter of fact, the church, the reason we have the respondent involved, and the respondent has to be notified what's going on, is because the church has a very strong conviction of the right of parties to know what's going on, to be served, to participate in the process. And if I violate any of that as a judge, then the annulment's void.
And who helps the people with the paperwork and preparing the documents? Is there a lawyer
no, they're not lawyers. Well, we have a lot of advocates in the parish who serve for free. Okay.
Advocates who are attorneys, or just people?
Some who are attorneys, some who are just church people who understand the process. The only paid personnel in the entire process, I'm not paid, I'm a volunteer. I'm a drafted volunteer. I'm a pastor of St. Thomas the Apostle Parish, so in this diocese, none of the priests are paid who are judges, okay? And but we do have 3 ladies down at the diocese that are paid to run this process. You can imagine it's much like a clerk's office, but more than a clerk. They're the ones who send out all the questionnaires and get them back. They prepare the file in the sense of putting it together, and they give it to a person that you probably have never heard of in annulment called an auditor. We've only have 2 canon lawyers in the diocese, and it'd be impossible for me to do every case along with Father Arnold. And so we have trained auditors who are, a number of them are civil lawyers, some of them are retired history professors from the university, all good men and women, sworn to secrecy. The whole process is secret except between the parties. The only persons who can see the files are the 2 parties.
Have to be Catholic to be an auditor?
Yes. And the auditors are prepare a proposed form of judgment and findings of fact and conclusions of law is what you'd call it. And then the judge will look at that and sort of use it, and then he'll read the whole file again himself, but use that as his model if he agrees with it and changes things and maybe adds testimony. And it lets us process cases that might take 5 years in 1.5 to 2 years.
What kind of numbers are we talking about in the Tucson area?
It depends. Normal year we get about 90 to 110 petitions for annulment.
And of those, how many are?
Probably half go to judgment. The other half probably get abandoned along the way.
How many are denied?
Well, that depends what you mean by denied. There's a self-selecting process, if you want to think about it. And people who know that they don't have grounds never file to begin with. And secondly, we advise people as it goes along that there's not enough evidence and they'll withdraw the case. So if someone insists on going forward with it, I probably grant 1 denial out of 50 or 60 cases. But it's not before the person's been warned that you probably should withdraw this and wait till you get better evidence.
Interesting. We apply that to our civil law,
Yeah.
actually.
Well, and you know, there's great confusion in that question you asked is always asked by a lot of Catholics because the term annulment is confused in their minds, okay? What I have just described is the formal annulment process, and you'll hear in every group you ever gather in, well, I know somebody who gave a priest $5,000 and got their annulment in 2 weeks. And I always say to them, fine, get me the name of the priest and I'll make sure he's never a priest again. But secondly, you're not getting any annulment in 2 weeks. What they're talking about is, in the Catholic Church, remember I said Catholics have to be married in the church, in front of a priest or deacon, or be dispensed from that officially, okay? Well, lots of Catholics get married civilly, and nothing ever happens. Okay, remember, we don't recognize that marriage for sacramental purposes. That's what we call just a defect of form. That's paperwork and some documents.
But those people got divorced civilly.
Civilly, and then they come to us.
They want to get married to somebody else. If you have somebody who never had a sacramental marriage, Catholic couple, never had a sacramental marriage, married by a judge, justice of the peace,
well, okay,
then they get divorced.
Oh, okay, you're doing two things there.
Okay.
Sacramental marriage means, remember, two baptized people. So
right,
you could have a non-sacramental marriage in the church between a Catholic and a non-Catholic, okay? Now I'm just talking about people, Catholics who never got married in the church, no matter who
right.
they're marrying. They would provide proof of their baptism, proof usually by 2 sworn statements, along with their baptismal record, that the marriage was never, the colloquial here is blessed in the church, validated in the church, never occurred in the church. And then I, as the judicial vicar of the diocese, will declare there never was a marriage because that person was bound to our form. Now, that's a 2-week process if you get me all the documents.
And $5,000.
No. Actually, there is no charge if you can't afford it, but there's a $50 charge just because it's a mess of paperwork.
No, if once again, this is more complicated than I thought it was going to be, but Catholic couple, married by a judge, non-sacramental marriage at that point.
Yeah, because they have to be recognized.
So then they get divorced, and then they can get married.
Yeah, sure.
So theoretically, a Catholic, as long as you weren't married
in the church,
you had sacramental marriage.
It's not as uncommon as you think. In many cultural traditions, some guys like to say, "We'll try it for 10 years, then we'll decide whether or not we want to get married in the church." You think that sounds strange, but it is true. Okay,
you're going to set a record today. I don't think I've gotten past the first page of my questions on that one, but that's good. It's fascinating to do that. We still have about 10 minutes left.
Sure.
But, one of the things I really wanted to go to, and I'm going to jump a little bit around at this one because the pre-Cana, am I pronouncing it correctly? Pre-Cana counseling has always fascinated me. Mm-hmm. I think it's just my exposure to it has been one of the few religions that really do a more formalized premarital counseling, which it seems to me is very helpful.
About 80 years ago, the bishops in the United States became very concerned about the divorce rate among Catholics, and would be concerned about annulment rates among Catholics. And a lot of it is, do you really know what you're doing? And so we got into the business of marriage preparation. And each diocese, as a matter of fact, among different priests, it's different. For myself, I'm a real firm believer in what's called engaged encounter, which is sort of a pre-Cana process. It's a weekend retreat. I require the couple to go on it. Starts on a Friday night, gets over on a Sunday afternoon. They do presentations. I like to tell the people this is not smells and bells and tinkling from the 1960s hippie movement, but it really doesn't depend on how good the presentation is. At the end of the presentation, they're split into 2 groups, guys on one side, gals on the other. They're given some written questions. They fill out the answers to the written questions. Then the 2 people who are going to get married get together and look at their answers to each other. Now, I can tell you that people who have known each other for 10 years, people, we don't approve of it, have lived together for 10 years, will find things out about themselves on that weekend that they've never really thought about. And I've had couples come back and tell me we're the best of friends, but we don't want to get married.
It's an interesting process. When I do the divorce mediation, I find the same thing you're describing happening in the mediation, where you think, and they sometimes have been, not only that they've been married for many years, and all of a sudden they're discovering things. I'm not sure.
So that
I think the counseling beforehand really is essential.
Right, and for a priest, if you're not, I mean, I was never married. What business do I have telling them how to, that sort of thing? That's why this engaged encounter is so important. It's married couples do it. Married Catholic couples do it. As a matter of fact, the model has been adopted by many of the Protestant denominations as a way of doing it. It's just a great model for helping people understand themselves. Now,
it's a prerequisite.
It is prerequisite. There are exceptions. If I'm marrying two 70-year-olds, I'm not going to make them go on an engagement encounter. I figure they know what they're doing. It's possible you get people who cannot do the weekend. For instance, guys who work for the Border Patrol, sometimes very difficult. We'll do individualized instruction, but I don't think it's anywhere near as good as the engagement encounter.
Do you have any statistics or any understanding of I'm not sure this is possible, of what the divorce rate or the annulment rate would be? I'm not sure doing that.
There are rumors of this and rumors of that. The best way I tell couples is the most likely place you're going to get divorced is in your first 5 years. Now that happens other times too. Obviously, marriages go on. But for the first 5 years, this process really reduces the divorce rate. And that's anecdotal to me, seeing how the process works. Now that's if they make use of the process. Some people go in there with a square mind that,
Sure.
Something I got to do, we'll get it over with, we'll kid around. And you can tell those couples when you do it, But they got a right to get married.
What about the people who go through that and then decide not to get married? Any sense of what the...
Maybe 1 out of 25, in my own experience.
And I think at that point you probably avoided a
disaster.
5 years, yeah.
Sometimes a marriage is more for the parents than it is for the kids.
It was, as I said, I've had some interesting experience with that, and I think in general the people who've gone through that, or my experience, are less likely.
Well, I think it's anything else. The better you know, the more you know, the more informed decision you make.
And I think I may have mentioned this to you. I was dealing with a couple once, and I thought it was interesting because they went through all this. And in their situation, they had a whole issue of whether they were going to have children, not have children.
Right.
But they hadn't somehow discussed the adoption issue, and that ended up becoming a problem later on because they hadn't discussed it. And if they had discussed it, I suspect they wouldn't have gotten married, and it would have avoided a lot of pain.
Yeah, and you see, the most common reason for an annulment was not the exotic examples I gave you. The most common reason is what is known as a serious lack of due discretion. That is, annulment is not the civil term for annulment. You got to be drooling, before they'll annul the marriage. It is, do you know what you're doing? Do you understand what forever means, what having children means, what faithful means, in a true sense?
Which is very different than civil, where really more often than not it's based on fraud.
Right, yeah. Well, we have fraud too. That's a different grounds, okay? Every ground you can think of in the civil law is in church law. But these three, the normal old-fashioned kind. But I'd say 80% of marriages that are granted annulments are under the serious lack of due discretion. And a lot of the pre-Cana is aimed at bringing that to the surface before it happens. Okay.
We've sort of gotten back to the annulment, which I think is good. What about the children? That's...
Oh, sure. The most common...
An issue that's, comes up a lot.
The most common issue you will have with a person is they'll come in, they will not have gotten an annulment till the kids are 21 because they think somehow that makes the kids illegitimate in the church. No.
It doesn't?
Nope. Never has, never will.
You got to get out there and talk more.
I know. I know.
I think the topics we've talked about, I don't think I've seen more misunderstandings.
I talk to parish ministers on that all the time. The other
that was the whole Kennedy. I think when Cuomo Kennedy annulment or something.
No, the children are totally legitimate. The church recognizes them as legitimate.
Where's that come
just
from?
Old-fashioned misinformation. For instance, people think you can't go to communion because you're divorced. Not that you've remarried, just because you're divorced. You can go to communion if you're divorced. It's when you remarry, that's a separate issue in the church, okay? Outside the church, okay, without an annulment or declaration of defective form.
And this is standard across the board. This is not change with parishes or...
I'm describing to you the law of the church.
Okay. And so the children are not
illegitimate.
Not illegitimate.
Because the church believes that everything that happened while the marriage existed, even though it's later declared invalid, there is a presumption the marriage was valid at the time. Okay? And so therefore the children are legitimate.
It's fascinating. It's really...
Of course, in Arizona it doesn't make any difference. There are no illegitimate children in Arizona by law, civil law.
No, I wasn't aware of that.
Yeah, everybody's illegitimacy under our Constitution is not there. That's your mother and that's your father.
Does the covenant marriage in Arizona affect any of this at all?
No.
A little bit. I think you mentioned, let's go a little bit back to marriage, and it's sort of interesting because you were talking about marrying Catholic and a non-Catholic, and I think you said you had performed some ceremonies actually with Catholic Jewish.
Oh yeah. It's easier to get a priest than it is a rabbi.
It is. That was what I mean. I've gone through that.
Usually not a rabbi. It's usually a cantor.
Certainly, maybe they were, Reform rabbis, perhaps. I don't think any conservative or Orthodox rabbis would go.
I've never done it with a rabbi. I've done it with a couple of female cantors.
Okay, but have you performed an actual ceremony?
Oh yes.
When you do that kind of a ceremony, is it any different than what you would normally do? Are we getting the huppah? Are we getting the broken glass?
No, you don't get the hoover, the broken glass, but it is one of the rare exceptions that the bishop in this diocese permit a marriage outside of a church. For instance, if you want to marry a Lutheran, you can get a dispensation from the bishop to have the Lutheran pastor perform the marriage. Okay? But the bishop if it's two Catholics, they absolutely have to be married in the Catholic Church. But one of the parties Catholic, one's not, the bishop can give a dispensation to permit the Lutheran, for instance, to marry them. We just do not permit marriages outside of houses of worship. Okay?
That's fairly typical.
Yeah. But when you're dealing with non-Christian religions, and obviously they can't use the temple, and for some reason the family would feel uncomfortable in a church, that is one of the rare reasons the bishop will permit the marriage to occur, for instance, outside at a country club or something. But it's the very rare situation.
And his ceremony, once again?
It's a very standard ceremony. It's a simple, you have an Old Testament reading, a New Testament reading, a short sermon, some questions that go to that freedom of marriage I was talking about. Do you know what you're doing? I mean, it's nicerly put than that. And then blessing of the rings, and you may kiss the bride. About 15 minutes. And
if you co-officiate?
We don't co-officiate.
You said you did with the cantor?
Well, the cantor was present.
Okay.
In the Catholic Church, whoever receives the vows has to receive them from both. Okay. You can't have the cantor receive them from the Jewish person and the Catholic priest receive them from the Catholic person. That's why, for instance, when I send it to a Lutheran church, I don't go there. The Lutheran pastor receives the vows. The cantor in that situation could even receive the vows of the Catholic party. But the Catholic parties can be just as stubborn as the Jewish party, so everybody wants somebody there.
Hopefully maybe you can come back some other day, we can discuss more of this, because it's really been an educational experience, I'm sure, for me and for everybody else. And you've been watching Divorce TV. Thank you very much, and we look forward to you watching our future shows. And once again, thank you very much, Reverend Lyons, for coming and speaking with us.
It's been a pleasure.